So I'm Joe Nadglowski from the US, from the Obesity Action Coalition. Honored to be here. These are my disclosures. Don't have any personal disclosures. I will say I do have biases though, because I am from the Obesity Action Coalition. I have my own lived experience with obesity, as well as been shared many experiences by our members, and so that does bias my thoughts in some way, so just keep that in mind. So I've really been asked to talk about weight bias and policy in the US, and I'll just be frank, I mean, everything we do is impacted by bias, whether it's research, access, prevention, or treatment. Weight-based discrimination remains legal in most situations in the US. Coverage of obesity care is limited, as Jimena shared in Canada, is similar in the US. Kind of this idea that punitive efforts to penalize people because of their weight are often proposed, whether that's by our key elected officials or through the people who pay for our health insurance in the US, which is usually your employer or an insurance company. Oversimplification of obesity is often reflected in policy efforts, and I think we saw that, Jimena pointed that out in Canada as well, so it's not unique in the US. And then our investment in research is also pretty small. So I'm going to highlight a couple of these, and I'm only going to talk about, obviously, this is the challenges with stigma, what's going on right now. Later on, I'll talk about some of the solutions we have, but to start off with the problems. So when it comes to weight-based discrimination, so US law does not include obesity as a protected class. The way I heard this described at a meeting from our own Centers for Disease Control was that an employer could decide to fire every employee whose BMI was above a certain level in the US, and it would be perfectly legal for them to do so. There is one state that makes that illegal, and that is Michigan, which has a law making employment-based discrimination illegal. And just keep in mind, it's just employment-based, so that means, for example, as a landlord could choose to not rent you an apartment because of your size, or a store could not serve you because of your size, and that is still perfectly legal. People often point out to me, well, we heard obesity as a disability mentioned earlier, what about the disability laws in the US? And the results have been pretty mixed. Our own Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and some courts have found that if you have severe obesity, that does qualify as a disability. There's an interesting requirement of that, though. You actually have to be able to demonstrate a physiological cause of your obesity for it to be considered a disability. And it's an interesting argument, and actually OEC is participating in a amicus brief filing in our own appellate court system right now, trying to have that overturned and just say simply reality is obesity is a disease. Not everyone who has obesity has a disability, but some may, and therefore let's not exclude them by requiring some level of documentation that's not required for any other disease. And frankly, you can see this data here. This is Rebecca Poole's data, who we've mentioned a lot today. But for example, if you are a woman, the most likely reason you're going to be discriminated against is because of your gender. But the second most likely reason is because of your weight. And this is work that she did many years ago, and here's that data broken down in a different way, just so you can see how soon and how often it happens. So women with severe obesity, BMIs above 40, those chances of discrimination are approaching close to 50%. And there's lots of other data around this in the employment setting, and we don't have time to talk about that today, but we even know that women who have obesity earn about 15% less on average in the US than their normal weight counterparts. We definitely see women being more vulnerable to weight discrimination. The other area that we see bias rearing its head is around coverage of obesity care, and very similar to what you saw in Canada, obesity coverage is lacking. Bariatric surgery is the best covered in the US. However, there are barriers put in front of people, and I'll show you a quote about that in a second, making it harder for people. So I guess about 70% of people have access to bariatric surgery in the US. Now, it doesn't mean that only 1% of people utilize the benefit, but it is much more common coverage. With that being said, I will tell you, for no amount of money can I buy coverage for the employees of the Obesity Action Coalition for obesity care. As a small employer, and remember in the US system, as a small employer, you buy insurance for your employees. That benefit is not offered to me. I cannot find an insurance company to do that, and that's been a challenge, and it is a challenge to many small businesses. I'll also point out that counseling is supposed to be covered actually under the Affordable Care Act, more commonly referred to now as Obamacare. Everyone is supposed to have coverage for counseling for obesity. However, that provision was never enforced under the Obama administration and now not enforced under the Trump administration. So while it exists in law, it exists in law only, and there's no practical use of that, or very limited practical use. And of course, pharmacotherapy is as limited as well, and it's something I struggle with personally because I use pharmacotherapy and I have to pay for that out of pocket. You know, bias really does drive this lack of coverage, and I won't cover both of these quotes. You can read them there, but I think the first one points out the message I said about bariatric surgery earlier. Well, this is a gentleman from a large insurer who basically said, fortunately, we have enough hurdles for those obese people that few of them make it through to get bariatric surgery. We don't need to be spending all that money on surgery and drugs when exercise works so well. And obviously, you see bias rearing its head there as well. And then you see the second comment about medication use and this interesting idea that, well, they're just going to regain their weight when they stop taking medications. And yes, people's blood pressure goes back up after they stop taking their blood pressure medicine as well, but we're okay with them taking blood pressure medicine for a long period of time. We see all kinds of policies that are really about penalizing people. Again, this blame and shame that's been pointed out previously. And yes, that is real on the top right-hand side there, where the state of Mississippi actually, someone in the state actually introduced legislation to ban people with obesity in the state from dining in restaurants. That was actually a real piece of legislation that a legislator did. Interestingly, the legislator who did it lived with obesity. And when we made national news on morning television and we were to debate that, he said he did it to gain attention around the topic. And I talked to him about there are much better ways than stigma and bias to gain attention around this topic. And luckily, the news reporter took him on in a very significant way, so I didn't have to be the bad guy. I could be the guy coming back with more appropriate solutions. But the reality is I don't think a day goes by that we don't see a penalty-based proposal. And again, in the US, where your employer pays for your insurance, employers are the ones who are often implementing these penalties as well, because they say your insurance is more expensive if you have obesity. Even though it doesn't cover obesity, your insurance is more expensive. The other issue, and I think this has been mentioned as well, is this idea of us conflating prevention and treatment. They really are not the same thing. And don't get me wrong, you're not going to meet someone who is a bigger advocate for making the healthy choice the easy choice. However, just making the healthy choice the easy choice for me is not necessarily a treatment for my obesity. They're not the same thing. And we see that quite often throughout all of our efforts, where we can get policymakers to think about prevention, but they're just not so interested in helping us with treatment, not helping those who already live with the disease of obesity. And of course, research is infected as well. So I wanted to just point out some of this data. So our own National Institute of Health, which funds about $32 billion a year in research, only 2% of that money goes to obesity research. About $800 million US dollars. And even though the obesity rate is 40% in our country. And frankly, if we look at the proposal for 2018, although we're already in it, everyone knows the US budget system is always crazy and they're fighting how they spend money throughout the year, but it looks like about a $200 million cut, more than 20%. And I know you're not going to be able to actually see all these things that it's not, but on the list of conditions that our research funds, and a lot of these are categorized into groups, but obesity is 51st on the list of conditions that are actually we fund research for. So we're number 51 on the list, even though it again is 40% of the population. And you can see the significant investments there. So we don't spend nearly enough dollars to try to impact obesity considering its prevalence. And I think that is bias-based as well. I didn't want to have everything be negative when I talk, so I just want to talk about a couple policy efforts. There is actually legislation in one of our states trying to take on this discrimination policies, making it illegal to discriminate. There's legislation called the Treat and Reduce Obesity Act that's trying to improve access to treatments. And then there are efforts nationally that I'll talk more about later that are about trying to change public perceptions, and that's our National Obesity Care Week resolution. So I'll end with this. U.S. policy efforts to curb obesity have in many cases stigmatized and in some cases outright discriminated against people with obesity. Policy efforts can play an important role in addressing obesity, but recognition that some efforts have caused a great deal of harm is lacking. And I think that's a real important issue, that much of what we've done has done more harm than good. And then, of course, obesity is bad, not the people who live with obesity. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to ask before we take the coffee break, does anybody have any questions for clarification for any of the speakers we've heard so far? Is there something that is unclear that you'd like to have clarified? Yes, please. Please state your name.
My name is Rami Hussein. I'm from Beirut. I'm a dietitian and I'm at the American University of Beirut. I had just two small questions. When you said it's regarding the discrimination laws, doesn't discrimination cover against physical appearance? Because technically, if we consider that obesity is not a disease, but it's obvious because we say it. But discrimination does prevent someone from discriminating against me because of my physical appearance.
Not the way the interpretation is. There's certain aspects of it. For example, your race may, or your ethnicity may, the law is specific about that.
Okay,
But,
so they specify that physical
right.
appearance means race. It doesn't mean if I'm ugly, because
Right,
some people
right.
are discriminated against because they're ugly.
Yeah.
Correct.
The Canadian
The law
Human
protects
Rights
them.
Act doesn't have size or weight as a protected area.
How about ugly?
No,
No.
They can fire me because I'm ugly?
no. Physical appearance is not, like even like tattoos, nothing like that it's not protected. Just physical appearance is not. The disability is protected, but obesity is not considered a disability in Canada, so.
Correct. And same in the US.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else?